Hello, everyone, and welcome to my 2021 capstone research project. My name is Hope Christofferson, and the title of this is In Forest and Field, and it's a very small folkloric illustrative book that tells the stories and the significance of the wildflowers of the Black Hills. And this is the result of me following my Bachelor of Fine Arts degree and exploring the woods, painting a ton of flowers, and then researching the significance behind them. So I think what I want to do is begin by reading you the back of the book. This is just a prototype right here. So hopefully there was an issue with the formatting where I was one page off and the corresponding information page didn't line up with the actual flower. It was just one off. So once that is figured out, then these will be available physical items of artwork that are a compilation of the illustrations that I made. But forward with a synopsis. Botanical illustration throughout the course of history has roots in both the realms of fine art and science. It is an art form reliant upon anatomical accuracy and creative prowess. Blending art, story, and botany, In Forest and Field tells the forgotten tales of wildflowers, visually and narratively illustrating the power the natural world has to offer stability and balance in the midst of uncertain times. Here, folklore, myths, and traditional medicinal uses of the wildflowers within are recorded. This book offers a varied samplings of the blooms found beside the streams, along the hillsides, and under trees in the enchanted forests of the Black Hills of South Dakota. The purpose of the work is to inspire a sense of wonder and appreciation for the botanical beauty that awaits one on their next walk into the woods. So I would like to begin by sharing a PowerPoint that kind of explores the inspiration that I have as an artist who's interested in fantasy and folklore and mythology, as well as botany and scientific accurate illustration itself. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen really quick for you guys. Beautiful. All right, and let's start from the beginning here. So In Forest and Field, all of these illustrations are ones that I painted, as well as the border ones. I used Procreate, which is an iPad application, along with a little bit of Photoshop and Illustrator to format this book into a PDF that could then be printed. So it's a collection of wildflower illustrations and lore from the Black Hills of South Dakota. So medieval inspiration. The 11th century really saw a growth in some of the first books that we today would consider herbals or herbariums or guides to flowers and plants that have medicinal uses. So the art of the medieval manuscript itself is astounding. It's beautiful. I remember seeing some when I was really young at a museum that I went to in Denver, and then I would look them up online and I would go to Pinterest and create boards out of all of these pages and scans that different libraries have available of books that were made throughout the medieval ages, because they didn't have printing presses in the way we think of them today. So every line was handwritten painstakingly with feather quills that somebody had to cut. All of the pigments they used in these beautiful books were sourced, and they used gold leafing, and everything was just very, very carefully done, very artfully done. So books in the medieval era, we're talking post-Dark Ages, like after the fall of Rome, they were pieces of art. They were treasures. They were hard to produce. They were hard to find, and they held ancient knowledge that only specific people could really understand, because reading itself was also a magical sort of thing. So that in mind, you look at these medieval manuscripts and you see the design work that goes into the text, that goes into the illustrative work itself, and you think about how hard it was to make that, and a sense of appreciation and real magic is really found within these. So herbals themselves, like the knowledge of herbalism and how people can use plants, it's been part of human history since the dawn of history. But the Greeks and the Romans were the first to really start to write down this information, so it wasn't just orally passed down from person to person. So after the fall of the Roman Empire, sadly, around 476, a lot of written records were lost. And moving into the medieval era, from the fall of Rome to this time throughout the Dark Ages, there was information that was kind of being kept around in a book called the Immateria Medica, which was written by a Greek physician in the Roman era, 50 to 70 AD, named Dioscorides. And so he wrote down all of this information about the plants, and people use this hundreds of years and then up into the 11th and 12th centuries when we start to see institutions and scholars and monks writing down this information. We begin to see the illustrations that accompany that, because pictures really are worth 1,000 words. And the Cotton Emis Vitellius C III is a manuscript that is absolutely beautiful, and it's one of the earliest to really lean heavily on botanical illustration. So although these may not be the most like accurate illustrations in the world, they still told 1,000 words. They were very important, and someone looking at this picture could tell a lot more than somebody who is reading a paragraph about what to look for when identifying this plant. And then you also have the typical medieval level of superstition with the snakes curling around, and you have mandrake roots that kind of look like people, as we see on this previous slide. So there's that element of folklore that was still embedded and intertwined within science in this era. And that's part of what makes the medieval manuscript itself such an interesting artifact to examine from a modern perspective. So as the years go by and we move from the medieval era into the Renaissance, into the Romantic period, we start to see these really beautiful herbariums as the printing press starts to come into being, and we can reproduce plates. So we have A Curious Herbal by the illustrator Elizabeth Blackwell, written in 1735, and this one featured 500 hand-detailed illustrations. So she would engrave these and then color them with watercolor. And unlike the medieval herbariums, she was focusing on the realistic depiction of flowers, of every aspect of plants, from the seed to the leaf to the fruit. She would take them from life, look at them, and recreate them for hundreds, thousands of other people to see, regardless of what time of year it was or where they were. All I needed was the book itself. And as we start to look at how naturalism and botany and biology sort of moved forward, we think of people like Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, who were exploring far corners of the earth and then needing to bring back their findings. And you can't always just press a flower or put some sort of insect in a jar and expect it to look the exact same as it did in its natural environment. So suddenly illustrators were needed to translate highly detailed visual knowledge with their paintbrush, with their pen and paper. And you start to see this need for the artist as a scientific tool start to emerge. And Pierre Joseph Rideau was one of the most well-known and talented botanical artists. And this is one of his works right here, where he would work with lithography, but he would also just do watercolors of botanical samples. And the level of just realism and value and depth and natural life that you can see in his work is astounding. It's a different type of magic that's slowly moving away from the medieval style of it. And so there's also the language of flowers, which was emerging in the Victorian era. And this was a method of communication that people used to convey messages that might have been a little bit too avant-garde for this very closed off, cloistered, well-mannered society would normally allow. So as people started to give each other bouquets, a need for a uniform language started to emerge, and flower dictionaries were being published. And these flower dictionaries were much like a regular dictionary, except for the fact that there would be an illustration of a flower, and then across from it, there would be its corresponding significance and how to incorporate this specific bloom in conjunction with others to convey a message regarding romance or scorn or apathy, hate, jealousy, love, anything and everything in between. So that sort of meaning imbued within flowers with florography itself, I just fell in love with. I've been interested in that for a very long time. And flower dictionaries were popular. The first one was published in 1818 by Charlotte de la Tour, and she was actually French, but this sort of like French fashion parlayed over into England as well. So Les Languages des Fleurs was one of the first ones to be published. And when I went to create this project, I kind of wanted to bring in that mysticism and stylistic, handwritten, hand painted element of the medieval manuscript in conjunction with botanical accuracy, as well as with the sort of magical florography feeling that you have. So there were those three main pillars that were kind of just jumbled in my head. And I was like, okay, how can I create something that incorporates all of these? And I think that I might have figured out a way through In Forest and Field, but it began in 2020 in the fall when COVID sort of forced everybody out of school. And I knew that I had to start working on some project, but I was feeling kind of lost. So my way of dealing with just the weirdness in the world was hiking, going into the woods. And that's when I started to pay attention to flowers and how they would bloom at very specific times, how unique they were, and how they were markers of certain spaces, certain types of soil, certain amounts of light, certain amounts of rain, and then also the time of the year. So the Pasque was one of the first ones that I found, and this is a little bee that was sitting within him. And so I would always take pictures with my phone, and I kind of kept those because I wasn't sure where the project was going in the beginning, but I do have some work in progress photos. So that makes this presentation a lot easier so I can visually show you how it began. And with the Pasque, what I did was I decided to sit down and illustrate it. I did 3 different versions. I have it budding up, I have it opening, and then an aerial view of the inside petals with the, the different pollinator areas, the pistil and the stamen. And here's another one, a mouse ear chickweed. These were really small, delicate white flowers that I had never paid attention to, but when I looked closely, I started to realize that they are implicitly unique and deeply, deeply beautiful. And then we have bluebells as well. And these are just some of the things that I started to really appreciate because I had the time all of a sudden. So this is how it began. I would take the flower, I would tape it next to my paper, and then I would do a pencil underdrawing and then some light washes of watercolor. And I would use a magnifying glass sometimes to really look at the detail within there. And I would just use a little sable brush. You can see my pencil and my brush that I got very attached to. And it's always hard when you use an art tool for a long time and it kind of dulls and you have to replace it. But, you can do some magical things with it. So this is Larkspur. That's an early spring bloom. This is the lady slipper orchid and the yellow spider that relies on it, and the flower relies on the spider to bring in food for each other. So I remember finding those and thinking that symbiosis was really wonderful. And this is an example of how I am painting those, and starting with an underdrawing and then going through and layering in the colors so that I can scan them later. And here's Vervain. This is a work in progress shot of how I would take my palette out in the woods. I just hike with it. I'd bring a bottle of water, a paintbrush, and of course my little dog Ivy would usually follow me, and I'd sit for a few hours. An illustration would take anywhere from 2 to 5 hours to finish, and I would work on it in the quiet of the woods. Bee Balm is another one of my favorites. You can see how I was using a little seashell for my water in my palette, and I was just working on the first layers there. Color swatching was an important element of the process, where I would put the petal down against the white of the paper and then just keep mixing and fiddling around with pigments until I got the perfect shade, the shade that really imbued that bright, vibrant nature of the specific flower. And this is the shooting star. It's very unique. It's very strange and wonderful. And as I got closer to making the book itself, I was moving away from just doing the botanical illustrations to the stylistic elements. So I started to paint some borders. You can see that swirl down in the bottom right-hand side. And then I started to make an alphabet too, which is really fun because in medieval manuscripts, you always have these super elaborate first letters that are set off. So I decided to give it a go and kind of create a fantastical, sort of whimsical, botanical set of letters that would go along for the book. And that's a Mariposa lily on the left-hand side. That was a fun one to paint. And this is what each page will look like. I just decided to put the bluebell up because I've had a number of slides of the bluebell itself. So sadly, the bluebell doesn't have a name in Lakota mythology, but I did put the scientific name there. You have a closer up illustration of the bloom itself with the interior anatomy sort of more visible for people to see. And that's one of the great things about botanical illustration is that you can really focus on something so small and magnify it to the eye and make it bigger on a piece of paper and allow people to see these magical, really detailed parts of living organisms that they wouldn't normally take note of. So you have when it blooms, you have where it blooms, you also have a short description as well as some of the medicinal uses and the history of it, the folklore. So there was one superstitious belief that somebody who wandered into a ring of bluebells would fall into an enchantment of sleep. And I thought that was rather beautiful because you see them and you do feel pretty peaceful. So, and their sap was used to bind arrows in books. And I like that. And then you have the cover of the book in Forest and Field. And of course, I'm sticking with the bluebell. That's personally one of my favorite little spring flowers. And then the back of the book, which I read you at the beginning of this presentation, but that is the main summary of this project that is incorporating these medieval and scientific illustrations and Victorian florography all into one thing right here. So it was really quite a amazing project to work on in the craziness of 2020. It was peaceful, it was grounding, and I hope that if it ever gets out in the world, if people are able to read it and see it, they feel that same like sense of magic and appreciation and enchantment for the forest. So thank you so much for watching this. I hope I haven't gone over my time limit too long, but I just want to say thank you to all of the professors who helped me throughout the course of making this book because it wouldn't have been possible without them. So thank you and enjoy. Have a good summer.